to transform the lower so that it no longer is manifesting a dissonant note, and that it's being adjusted so that it becomes harmonic and integrated with that higher note that you've been sensing. In this philosophy, there's a process called soul infusion that I'd like to share with you. Soul infusion is this. I'd like to imagine that I've got a sphere here, and it's the soul, and it's sounding its note, it's sounding its quality. And imagine that down here I have a personality, and that's the note. And now I know I've got two notes here. Well, when you wake up to the two notes, they're still kind of apart, but you know they're both there, and they're dissonant. But slowly you're trying to infuse the soul into the personality and convince that personality to give up the directing of the orchestra and allow another director to guide the show, to guide the musical composition. And that's a gradual adjustment from a dissonant relationship between these two notes within you to a gradual process of harmonization. And when they're fully harmonized, that is to say they both are completely fused together, in the ancient esoteric literature that's called the transfiguration. That's when there's no longer any part of you that has a dissonant note to the higher part of you. It is in complete, it's a chord, a harmonic chord. So I'm using this kind of using sound to try to give you a sense of that process of bringing the two parts of you together and allowing the higher to move you forward. But also, as I said, when you're on the path and you're thinking about not only trying to live more that higher note, but you're also trying to, you get this sense that there's a need to go and do something to make the world a better place. So you're trying to be more expressive of that higher note. Now what's interesting about that is that in a way what you're trying to do is to learn how to sound your note out in the world, that higher note. Let me tell you a little story. As I was driving over here today thinking about this talk, I flashed on something that happened to me, a true story that really woke me up to this process of service on the behalf of the soul. Many years ago I was a student in this philosophy in California, and I was, for a variety of circumstances, I moved from California to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I know, it's a strange thought, isn't it? And I got to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but I was still a student and I would travel back to California regularly. So I went to Pittsburgh, and I wasn't a teacher of this philosophy at all, but I was feeling that that was coming, okay? And an interesting thing happened. I got to Pittsburgh, and my first impression of the city was it was like it was 10 or 15 years behind the times. And so I felt a little discouraged that somehow, even if I were to start putting myself out there, I would, it wouldn't catch, and people wouldn't resonate to it because they weren't ready for it, you know? So I was there for about a year, and then I went back to California to meet with my classmates, and a good friend of mine who was a classmate, her name was Rebecca, she came up to me and she said, "So William, how's it going in Pittsburgh? Have you got something going yet?" And I said, "No, no." And she says, "Well, why not?" And I said, "Well, you know, the truth is I just don't think that Pittsburgh is the place to do it. I mean, it feels like they're 10 years behind the times." And she looked at me and she snarled and she said, "William, you've got to sound your note." That's a quote. "You've got to sound your note." And it took me back. I fell back, and I was just, it was such a hit of wake up to the fact that you can't really get out there and do some service in the world unless you are willing to take the risk and sound that higher note. And for me, it's a higher note that has to do with teaching, but for other people it might be, it can be whatever that higher note is. What is that higher note? It's another way of saying your gift. What is your gift? What is the best part of you? What is the thing in you that you feel if you could bring it more fully into the world, it would make a positive difference? It would make the world a better place. And that's your note. And I was afraid of bringing it forth. And I'm glad that she shook me up. She scolded me. And I went back to Pittsburgh and I said, okay. So then the next thing I did was I wrote an article. And it took a year, but it got published in a local magazine, and then it led to something else. And so I sounded my note initially by not speaking, but by writing, and then that led to other opportunities. So doors started to open, but you can't have the doors open unless you sound your note. You see? It was a big lesson for me, big lesson for me. So I put it out to you. I mean, think about your own lives. How are you doing with the sounding of your note? Are you putting it out there? Are you moving forward with it? It's a big question. It's a big question. Because see, what happens is when you really when you sense those deeper qualities and you really say, I'm going to go with it, what happens is that lower note, that lower part of you, rises in opposition or finds clever ways of convincing you that its note is really the better note. Or that the ego is somehow your safe haven. So you get what is called the rising of the ancient fires, where there's a resisting force that will try to prevent you from sounding forth that higher note. Now and it could be fear, for instance. That could be part of the resisting force. But your lower self will assert itself at a certain point and try to prevent you from moving forward. And you see that not just as in the individual case, but you also see it sociologically. You see, because in this philosophy it's understood that it's not that just that you have a soul and a personality and they at times are struggling with each other, a higher note and a lower note. Social systems are living entities. Politics is alive. Business is alive. Science is alive. Religion is alive. And they too have a higher and lower nature. They have a higher note and a lower note. And look at the world today. The world, you know, I have a whole idea here that really, right now, humanity is awakening to its higher note. All of humanity is hearing a higher sense, a higher possibility. It's sensing a possibility that represents an understanding that we are truly all one. And that higher possibility is what is playing out in our world politics and our economics today. But that idea is interesting because as this higher possibility, the soul of humanity awakens, we see a resisting force rise to the surface. And so what have we seen the last few years? We've seen the worst of politics as well. We've seen the worst of economics. We've seen the worst of, religion for sure. We've seen the worst of that. And so this is another example of what I'm saying when I talk about how there's a resisting force that tries to prevent that higher note from coming into the game. And that's what we're seeing right now. It's really interesting in the ancient literature that lower resisting sound, you might say, it's called the ancient fires. The ancient fires. And that's an esoteric phrase for old ideas that have outlived their usefulness. Old ideas that have outlived their usefulness, and that's an old sound. That's an old way of being, and it resists the new. And that's where we're at today. We're trying to resonate to a higher note, and the ancient fires are rising in defiance. It's kind of interesting, because what is that higher note for all of humanity really about? It's about recognizing that we're all one. That's a fundamental principle here. It's about recognizing that egalitarianism is the way of the future. It's a note that's trying to say to us as a collective whole that diversity is the only way that we can realize our oneness. It's a note that's saying the environment, that everything is connected, and that everything that we do as a species is not separate from nature, but an integral part of nature, for the good or the ill. All of that is a higher set of values, a higher set of principles, a higher note, trying to penetrate, just trying to penetrate into the collective humanity. But what's so interesting about that is that as that happens, shadow issues, which are lower notes, rise out of fear. And that's what we've been seeing the last few years, a resistance in that sense.